All right, guys. Last set of notes for this chapter, Africa. When we do this in class, we usually spend a lot of time on Africa. We do a couple activities in the library. Obviously, we're not doing that, but these notes, it's a one-pager. It's the last kind of set of notes in your green packet you got on Friday, March 13th. You also see notes that look like this. We're skipping this. So like I mentioned, we usually do an activity in class, and that this kind of matches with it. So do not worry about doing this part. I'm not going to cover it. I'm just going to do the page that looks like this instead, okay? All right, so Africa was a spot where a lot of European countries wanted to imperialize. Africa had not industrialized, so they were not, they did not have advanced weaponry, and the Europeans could easily take advantage of that. This is one of the activities we would usually do. We're going to talk about something called the Berlin Conference, where Africa is pretty much cut up and carved up like a puzzle, and we would have done something similar, but we're not, so that's okay. All right, so European nations are going to dominate Africa. You can see that colorful map here. The activity we would have done would have resembled that. And it goes from 1880, kind of right as Industrial Revolution is at its peak, to 1914, which is when World War I started. That's really what ends African imperialism. If you look at this map here, Africa is going to be divided into tribal clans before Europeans come in and take over. So there's a lot of different tribal groups, a lot of different cultures throughout the continent of Africa, and they would have divided themselves in this fashion. Once, powerful Islamic kingdoms also existed throughout Africa before European imperialism. During the Age of Exploration, a lot of Europeans really just kind of hung out on the coast of Africa. The central part of the continent had not been explored. It had not been identified. And so as Europeans went to Asia and India and around the southern tip of Africa, they would stick sometimes close to the coastline to port or to get sometimes slavery. They would go and capture slaves along the coast and take them to their colonies. But as time goes, the Industrial Revolution is really ramping up, and I'll go here if you need that note and pause, and always pause this as we go if you feel like I'm going too fast and you need to write slower. So the first Europeans that explored the interior of Africa were mostly missionaries and explorers. So they're looking there to get, just to map the area out, to explore the region. This man, David Livingstone, if you remember the motives notes that we did, depending how you're pacing yourself on all of this, that would have been possibly something you did Monday, March 16th. But you looked at various placards of motives for imperialism. David Livingstone had that exploratory motive. And so they were there to explore and to convert the people to Christianity. As they explored, there was a lot of natural resources and large deposits throughout Africa. And we've already talked about the nationalism motive as well. So this cartoon, I really like it. It gives you a good example of all the people who are tugging and pulling for a piece of Africa. It's essentially a race to see who can get there and who can get the best parts and get the best materials out of Africa. Social Darwinism, the idea of survival of the fittest, steamboats, industrial weapons. Native Africans could not compete with that. They did not have the materials to fight back against that. Instead, they had very primitive weapons that the Europeans demolished very quickly. So as this goes, the Europeans become very afraid that this is going to lead to war and that there's going to be, this massive fight as European countries are trying to get the best parts of Africa. So in 1884, 14 nations are going to meet in Berlin, Germany, to have the Berlin Conference. And they're going to set the rules for colonizing in Africa. So basically, they want to decide how they're going to colonize the country. Like, so that, or the continent, excuse me, so that they are not going to have a war, so that the countries are not going to fight with each other over land. So this is where we would have had kind of a conversation. What kind of rules do you think they came up with? How do you think they are going to do this fairly? Obviously, we're not going to have that conversation, but you can brainstorm some of those ideas as we go, as we've done in the past. You can pause the video, and then after you've brainstormed, you can start the video again. All right, so one of the rules they came up with that any nation that laid claim in Africa would notify the other nations and show they could control the area. So they didn't want people just claiming a land and then not being able to actually maintain and control that area. So you would have to let all the other countries know, hey guys, this is the region of Africa we have claimed, and we're going to successfully control this area. You may have guessed no African nations were invited to attend, and no concern was given to those tribal boundaries or the ethnic divisions in Africa, like I had mentioned. So it was really kind of a, the European dominated, like you got to think for a second, how are the native Africans feeling about this? I'm giving this example in one of the other notes handouts, but if I came to your house, knocked on the door, let myself in and said, hey, I'm claiming this land, you have to listen to me now, you wouldn't feel so great about that. And that's exactly, an understatement, but that's how the Africans felt. So by 1914, this is pretty much how the African continent is divided. You see that the Europeans are going to control 90% of Africa. France takes most of West Africa. Belgium claims the Congo and Central Africa. And Germany has a lot of colonies throughout Africa. They're using this little territory to gain raw materials. So diamonds, tin, gold, rubber, cash crop plantations. They're using this territory to bring slaves back to their European countries. So, they're really just taking advantage of what Africa has and not really putting a lot into Africa. The most dominant, you may have guessed, was Great Britain. We've talked about Great Britain and how they dominated India and how they have colonies all around the world. They will be the most dominant power through Africa. And it's just because they want raw materials. They've got factories, they're making goods, and they want raw materials to make those goods. They'll claimed Egypt, and then a lot of colonies here in East Africa, and then South Africa as well. They'll control the Suez Canal. If you look at this map here, if you wanted to go to India, originally this is the direction of this red line that you would go. Well, now that they control the Suez Canal, that's going to be much, much shorter, much quicker, much more efficient, and less expensive. They also control South Africa from the Dutch. There's been a strong British influence in that region, even still today. Typically, we do a little unit about South Africa in modern times. Not sure that we'll do that, given the circumstances this year, but there's a lot of information out there if that's a region of the world that interests you. A lot of English citizens really dreamed of having all of Africa. They called it from Cape Town to Cairo. So Cape Town is here in Africa, Cairo is here in Egypt, and obviously this guy looks like he's playing Twister, but it shows how many regions of the world Britain had colonized and had an influence in. We've seen this image here, the Rhodes Colossus. This is Cecil Rhodes. He had the De Beers Diamond Company. Obviously, if you don't know, diamonds are very expensive. It's a very sought after thing, gem or jewel. And he is going to build quite a bit in Africa, but really it's only to help the British and it's only to help his business. And so he'll build railroads and telephone lines and whatnot, but they're only things that are going to help him. It's not designed to help the native African people, and will help gain colonies for Britain in South Africa. And as I've already mentioned, he uses his wealth to build infrastructure and things throughout Africa, but it's things that only actually help him and the British and not the Africans. All right, so the impact of this, Europe does introduce new technologies. The negative side is it only is going to help the European businessmen. It's not designed, if you look right here, all these black lines, these are Africa's railroads. They go from ports to where they need to get stuff. It's not designed to help the people of Africa. Europeans brought an end to the slave trade, but Africans are going to be exploited so much and paid such a low wage that it's essentially like they're living in slavery. Like, yeah, you say, okay, you guys can work, but we're not going to pay you enough money to live on. So basically, you're still enslaved and have to do whatever I say anyway. Europeans build schools, churches, and hospitals, but again, Africans are taught European culture. These schools and churches are not to celebrate African culture, it's to force European culture upon them. Europeans are going to make money off of African cheap labor and raw materials. Africans are unable to rule themselves, participate in voting, or learn professional skills. So if they're not able to learn professional skills, basically they then are forced to do whatever the Europeans train them to do, whether it's working on a cash crop plantation or mining diamonds, whatever the case may be. And then in South Africa, British segregation is going to cause a lot of issues. This is something called an apartheid, remained in place for over 100 years. Like I mentioned, this is something that I do a mini unit on typically, probably won't this year. But there's quite a bit of resources out there covering this topic if that is something that you wanted to dig in deeper. Or you can always ask and I can share things with you as well. Africans rebelled against European rule. As I've mentioned, though, they are fighting with spears and swords, and Europeans have industrialized weapons and guns. Africa remains under the control of European imperialism from the 1880s until the 1950s and 60s, which, guys, that's really, really recent, and Africa is still recovering from the impact of imperialism, and there's still parts of Africa that are not industrialized because they just relied on Europe. Okay, so that covers Africa. We mentioned the Berlin Conference. That's one of the most important parts that I usually focus on, just talking about how the Europeans were dividing Africa with no regard for the native Africans, simply worried about getting things for themselves. Hopefully you filled out the notes. Watch the YouTube video that I posted. Fill out I think there's 8 or 9 questions that go with that. And then tomorrow or whatever your timeline on this, next you'll do chapter 17, section 4, which will be posted to Google as well. As always, reach out with questions. Hope everyone's doing well. Let me know if I can help.